The room didn't react immediately. That's what made it worse. 17 years of her name quietly stitched into every successful quarter, reduced to a number that didn't move. Not even adjusted, just enough. She didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't even blink the way people do when they're trying to hold something together in front of others. Instead, she reached into her bag and placed a thin envelope on his chair, precisely centered, like it belonged there more than he did. And that was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but if you knew where to look, you'd notice. Because sometimes the most dangerous move in a room full of authority is the one that doesn't ask for permission, and no one there realized yet what exactly she had just set in motion. The meeting moved on as if nothing had happened. Slides advanced, numbers updated. Someone cleared their throat and continued reading from a report that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. The CEO adjusted his cuff, didn't even glance at the chair. The envelope stayed there, unopened, like a quiet interruption no one wanted to acknowledge. But the room felt it. Not consciously, no one said a word. Yet something in the air shifted almost imperceptibly, like pressure before a storm that hasn't announced itself yet. Conversations became slightly more careful. Pauses stretched half a second longer than usual, and still no one touched the envelope, because touching it would mean admitting it mattered. 2 seats down, someone finally looked up, not at the screen, but at the empty chair she had just left. 17 years, not written on the slide, not reflected in the metrics, just gone, replaced by a line item that didn't need explaining, or so they thought. The CEO continued speaking, voice steady, confident, practiced. The kind of tone that doesn't expect resistance, that assumes alignment is already in place. But something subtle had broken, not in the numbers, not in the presentation, in the structure. Because systems like this don't fail loudly, they don't crack in obvious places, they shift underneath quietly until one day the surface no longer holds. And she had just stepped off it, without raising her voice, without asking for reconsideration, just stepped away. Across the room, one of the newer hires glanced again at the envelope. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, hard to tell, but the look lingered just a fraction too long, as if recognizing something others had chosen not to see. The meeting ended on schedule. Chairs moved, laptops closed, people stood up quickly, too quickly. Conversations resumed, but lighter, forced, like everyone agreed not to mention what had just happened because nothing had happened officially. The CEO was the last to leave. He gathered his papers, checked his phone, paused for a second, just long enough to notice the envelope. He looked at it, then away. A decision made in less than a second. Leave it, for now. Because whatever it was, it could wait. After all, everything important had already been decided, right? The room emptied, the envelope stayed, and somewhere far outside that glass-walled silence, processes had already started moving. Not fast, not visibly, but precisely, the kind that don't need noise to take effect. And by the time anyone realized, it wouldn't be about the number anymore. By the time the elevator doors closed behind her, the building had already begun to forget. That's how systems protect themselves. They compress people into functions, functions into metrics, and metrics into neat, defensible decisions. 17 years becomes a line in a spreadsheet, a delta, a variance, something you can justify with a sentence that sounds reasonable, until it isn't. She didn't rush. Her steps were measured, almost indifferent, as if she were leaving a place that had already stopped being hers long before this morning. Outside, the city moved with its usual precision, cars flowing, signals changing, people crossing without looking up. Inside the building, something less visible was starting to shift. At 12:14 p.m., the envelope was no longer on the chair. No announcement, no curiosity in the hallway, just gone. At 12:19 p.m., an internal message was sent. Short, neutral, almost routine. Please review attached. No urgency flag, no explanation. But it didn't go to a manager, it went to counsel. And that was the first miscalculation, because legal doesn't react to tone, it reacts to structure. The attachment wasn't emotional. No accusations, no dramatic language, just documentation, clean, chronological, precise enough to be uncomfortable, pay bands, historical adjustments, external benchmarks, internal discrepancies, 17 years, mapped, not as loyalty, as data. At 12:43 p.m., the first response came back, not to her, to the CEO. A single line in the subject preview was enough to change the posture of the afternoon. Preliminary review indicates potential exposure under Section 11 pay equity. The sentence didn't finish there. It didn't need to, because everyone in that building understood what lived behind those words. Not opinion, risk. At 12:51 p.m., a second message followed. Different sender, same thread, more direct. Recommend immediate internal audit. Potential for collective claim. That was the moment the room changed. Not physically, the same glass walls, the same polished table, the same muted reflections of a company that believed it understood itself, but structurally, because decisions that felt final in the morning now had variables, and variables create instability. The CEO read the message twice, then a third time. The number, $19,000, suddenly looked different, not as savings, as leverage. Across the floor, doors that usually stayed closed were opening. Conversations that typically waited for scheduled slots were happening in low voices, without invites. No one mentioned her name. They didn't have to, because this was no longer about a person. It was about pattern. And patterns, once documented, don't stay contained. They replicate, they scale, they become something that can't be dismissed with a sentence like, "Yours is enough." By 1:30 p.m., HR had been looped in. By 1:47 p.m., someone quietly asked for historical compensation files. By 2:05 p.m., the word precedent appeared in writing. And that's when the realization started to settle in. Not all at once, but in fragments. What she left in that envelope wasn't a resignation. It was a framework, a structure that didn't need her in the room anymore to continue working. Because the moment it reached the right hands, it stopped being negotiable. And somewhere between those emails and the silence that followed, the cost of enough began to recalculate itself. If they had opened that envelope earlier, if they had understood what it contained before it moved, maybe this would have stayed small, contained, manageable. But systems don't fail because of one decision. They fail because of the moment they assume nothing will happen after it. And this time, something already had. If you've ever sat in a room where a decision felt final, clean, justified, untouchable, pause for a second. Because sometimes the real story doesn't start when someone speaks. It starts when someone stops arguing, stops explaining, stops asking for permission to be seen, and just leaves the right thing behind. Think about your own workplace. What looks like just a salary discussion, but is actually a structural imbalance waiting to be documented? Because leverage doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it's quiet, precise, and already in motion before anyone realizes it exists. By 3:12 p.m., the word audit stopped being theoretical. It moved from suggestion to action. A shared folder appeared, restricted access, tight permissions, no notifications beyond the people who needed to see it. The kind of space that doesn't exist in a company's everyday rhythm, the kind that signals something has already crossed a line. Files began to populate, compensation histories, role descriptions, adjustment justifications that once sounded reasonable in isolation, but now placed side by side began to echo differently. Not wrong, not yet, but inconsistent. And inconsistency, in the language of Section 11, pay equity, is where questions begin. HR wasn't leading anymore. Legal was. That shift alone changed the temperature of the building. Because HR manages people, legal measures exposure. At 3:47 p.m., the first internal comparison report was generated, not broad, not dramatic, just a narrow slice. Same role, similar tenure, different entry points, new hires, higher base, faster adjustments, and a pattern that didn't align with any formal policy on paper. The numbers didn't accuse, they didn't need to, they simply aligned, and alignment in the wrong direction is louder than any complaint. Across the corridor, a manager closed their office door mid-conversation. Another canceled a meeting without explanation. Calendars began to shift in ways no one announced, but everyone noticed, because something had changed, not the facts, the visibility of them. At 4:05 p.m., a third message from council landed. Longer this time, more precise. Disparities appear systematic across multiple cohorts. Exposure increases if pattern extends beyond isolated cases. Recommend immediate containment strategy. Containment, not correction. That word lingered, because containment assumes something is already out, already moving. The CEO leaned back in his chair, reading the message in silence that felt heavier than the entire morning meeting combined. The envelope, still on his desk now, opened, contents reviewed, and understood, too late. Because what was inside wasn't just her situation, it was a map. One that pointed not to a single discrepancy, but to a structure that had quietly repeated itself over time. And structures once mapped don't disappear. They become evidence. At 4:22 p.m., someone asked a question no one had prepared for. How many others could mirror this? No one answered immediately. Not because they didn't have an estimate, because they understood what any number greater than one would mean. Across departments, subtle recalculations were happening, not in spreadsheets, but in people's heads. Conversations from months ago, raises that didn't come, comparisons that didn't make sense, but were easier to ignore at the time. Now, suddenly harder, because once a pattern is named, it stops being invisible. At 5:03 p.m., the first external risk was mentioned. Not filed, not initiated, but considered. Potential for class action increases with awareness. Awareness. That was the variable no one could control anymore. Because the moment something like this exists, documented, structured, reviewed, it doesn't stay contained to a single office or a single decision. It waits for the right moment, for the right number of people to see it. And then it moves, quietly, just like she did, leaving the building hours earlier without looking back. By early evening, the building was quieter, but not calmer. Lights stayed on longer than usual, doors remained closed, conversations dropped below the level of sound that carries, but not below the level that matters, because by now everyone who needed to know knew, not everything, but enough. At 6:18 p.m., a revised briefing from council landed on the CEO's desk, structured, numbered, precise in the way only legal language can be when it's trying not to escalate, but already has. Preliminary exposure, medium to high, risk factors, tenure disparity, entry compensation variance, adjustment lag, escalation trigger, internal awareness across impacted cohorts. He didn't move immediately, just read once, then again, slower, because the words had shifted, not in content, in weight. What had been a decision in the morning now read like a liability in the evening. The number, $19,000, was no longer a line item. It was a reference point, a baseline for something larger. At 6:32 p.m., finance was looped in, quietly. No subject line that would attract attention, no mass distribution, just a request. Model retroactive alignment scenarios. That was the second shift. Because once finance starts modeling the past, it means the future is already compromised. And the models came back faster than expected. At 7:04 p.m., the first estimate appeared. Contained, conservative, still uncomfortable, not because it was catastrophic, because it was scalable, one adjustment manageable, 5 noticeable, 15 strategic, 50 structural. No one said the last number out loud. They didn't need to, because the trajectory was already clear. And trajectories, once calculated, don't reverse themselves without cost. At 7:19 p.m., HR sent a follow-up. Careful wording, measured tone. Recommend controlled communication strategy. Timing critical to minimize amplification. Minimize amplification, another word that lingered, because amplification implies something is already capable of spreading, and the only thing more expensive than a problem is a problem people start talking about. Across the floor, phones lit up, private messages, short questions. Did you see this? Is this about, are we included? No confirmations, no denials, just awareness building in fragments, the most efficient way it always does. At 7:41 p.m., the CEO finally stood up, walked to the window, city lights reflecting back, not offering clarity, just mirroring the same complexity now inside the building. Behind him, on the desk, the envelope, still open, still precise, still doing its work, because what she left wasn't reactive, it wasn't emotional, it didn't need her voice to defend it. It was structured to outlast the room. And that was the final realization. This wasn't about stopping something. It was about how far it had already gone, without noise, without confrontation, without a single raised voice, just alignment, data, timing, and the quiet certainty that once the right system touches the right information, the outcome stops being negotiable. By the time the building finally dimmed, nothing had been publicly announced, no statements, no corrections, no visible change, and yet everything had shifted because enough had been measured, and it didn't hold. Morning didn't reset anything, it just made everything visible. At 8:06 a.m., the first calendar blocks appeared, unusual titles, restricted lists, durations that didn't match the usual rhythm of routine check-ins. No agenda attached, no description, but everyone knew what they were. Conversations that had already started, now formalized. At 8:22 a.m., HR sent a controlled message to a limited group. Please be available for a brief alignment discussion regarding compensation structure. Alignment, not correction, still, but the language had shifted again, because alignment implies movement, and movement implies that something is no longer fixed. In the same minute, 3 different managers opened the same internal dashboard. Compensation ranges, filters applied, tenure versus entry point. They didn't coordinate. They didn't need to. Because once a pattern is recognized, people start checking where they stand inside it. At 8:47 a.m., the first conversation didn't happen in a meeting room. It happened between two people near a coffee machine, quiet, direct. Were you hired after me? Yes. And you're at a pause, numbers exchanged, no reaction, just a silence that lasted long enough to confirm everything. That's how awareness stabilizes, not through announcements, through comparison. At 9:03 a.m., Council issued the first directive with operational weight: pause non-critical compensation decisions. Initiate internal review across identified cohorts. Preserve all related documentation. Preserve. Because from that point on, this wasn't just internal, it was defensible or not. At 9:19 a.m., Finance updated the model. Expanded scope, more variables. The numbers didn't explode, they clarified. And clarity in this context was more dangerous than scale because it removed ambiguity. It showed exactly where the structure bent and how often. At 9:36 a.m., someone asked the question again, this time in a room where answers matter. If one files, how many follow? Silence. Then a number, lower than worst case, higher than comfortable, enough to change strategy, because once a collective claim becomes plausible, individual cases stop being isolated. They become coordinated. At 10:02 a.m., the CEO sat down with counsel. No presentation, no slides, just documents, the same ones that had moved through the system the day before, now interpreted, framed, positioned not as internal misalignment but as external risk. Under Section 11, consistency is not optional, Council said evenly. If disparities align with tenure patterns and lack documented justification, exposure compounds. Compounds, like interest. Except this time, it wasn't revenue growing, it was liability. The CEO didn't respond immediately, because by now there wasn't a decision left to make in the usual sense. Only a direction to choose, correct or defend, and both had cost. At 10:28 a.m., the first draft of a communication plan appeared. Careful language, neutral tone, no admission, no denial, just intent, review, adjustment, commitment to equity, words designed to stabilize without triggering, but words in a system that has already seen the data don't lead. They follow. At 10:47 a.m., the first external variable entered the room. Has she contacted anyone? No answer, because no one knew, and that uncertainty was heavier than any confirmed action. Because once information like that leaves the building, control doesn't just weaken, it dissolves. At 11:12 a.m., something subtle happened. People stopped speaking in hypotheticals. No more if, only when. When adjustments roll out, when communication goes live, when questions come in, that shift, small, almost invisible, was the final confirmation. The structure had already moved past the point of denial. Now it was operating in response mode. And response mode is always more expensive, because it happens after leverage has already been established. By 11:40 a.m., the building looked normal again. Meetings resumed, emails flowed, keyboards clicked with the same rhythm as any other day. But underneath, everything had been recalculated, because one sentence, yours is enough, had met a system that could measure exactly what enough meant, and found it lacking. She wasn't in the building. She didn't need to be, because what she left behind didn't argue, didn't demand, didn't negotiate. It simply aligned the right information with the right structure. And once that happens, outcomes stop being controlled by authority. They're defined by what can be proven. And that is where silence becomes irreversible.